Welcome back to Konstantinovsk and the year 1980. It's been a while since we started an episode with a recap, so come and join me for a quick tour. And I thought this would be a good chance to properly showcase some of the off-camera builds that I did for the newsreel bonus episode that came out earlier this month. But more on that in just a moment. As you know, I'm continually updating areas of the city that are considered completed. Everything's a work in progress, but this episode's going to feature one of the biggest updates yet, brought to you by the man behind this Lenin statue and the Palace of Sports, series co-creator at this point, Chris Brammer. So those were a couple of shots of the Palace of Sports and Baltica Stadium, both of which featured in my last episode, the Olympics bonus episode. So I have to really take a moment to thank Chris once again, and my dear friends Lily and Elise for their vocal talents. They really made that episode what it was. And I have to doubly thank Lily, especially because she sent me a copy of this book, Soviet Cities, which features a building that we're going to get quite familiar with over the course of this episode. And besides that, I'm definitely going to be citing it for information over the course of the rest of this series. So thank you for that invaluable source, my friend. Much appreciated. But comrades, the old recap is ending, the new episode struggles to be born, and now is the time of monsters, or something like that. Either way, it's time for me to wrap this up, and I will see you at the starting line. So in today's episode, we're building the Konstantinovsk version of the upper and lower ponds of Kaliningrad. And I asked friend of the show, Roman B., who is an ex-Kaliningrader himself, if he could tell me anything about the ponds. And what he did was send me over two incredibly detailed documents, one on each of the ponds, full of pictures and information and dates, all the minutiae of information that I could possibly need to create the ponds. And I learned a lot from it, and I'm going to be citing it throughout this episode. But we're going to start with this cascade of fountains, which is at the northern end of the lower pond. So before anything else, thank you so much, Roman, for taking the time to compile these documents, put all this information together for me. For this series, it's far above and beyond what I expected, and it was such a great help in putting this episode together. So, without further ado, the Cascade of Fountains. Now, this was constructed in the early 1930s, 1933, I believe, and it was a sort of decorative way of letting the runoff water from the upper pond into the lower pond. These ponds, both of them, are actually man-made structures, and as Roman points out in his document that he sent me, they're the oldest man-made structures in Kaliningrad and former Königsberg, having been first constructed in 1256. So that makes them the oldest remaining structures that are still standing, well, not exactly standing, really, but that remain in the city since its inception. And of course, the Cascade of Fountains fell out of use due to the Second World War, and they weren't restored until the 2000s. Now that's in the real-world timeline of Kaliningrad, but we're here in the alternate universe where everyone has goatees and Kaliningrad has a different name and a much bigger budget, so it's being restored right now. And one of the most important things for this build that I found were these terraforming tools. So here, whenever you see those sort of green lines where there's apparently nothing there, those are terraforming networks. They've been very handy for very precisely creating thin strips where the water turns into a sort of small stream, or indeed in this case where you need to create a very small dip in the middle of the terrain. That being said, the actual water in Cities Skylines is a pretty unpredictable resource, so for more controlled areas and smaller areas like this, I'm using, once again, these water surfaces that I use to create the fountains by the drama theatre. several episodes ago now. And this particular area took the longest out of this entire episode to build, simply because it is so fiddly getting down to the fine details with the thin staircases. And I initially thought that I would do a simplified version of it, but then no, that wasn't satisfying enough for me. I had to go and torture myself for a good couple of weeks getting this thing done. But you can see here I'm going right down into the small details, like putting those little Looney Tunes tunnel style asphalt pieces to make it look like the place where the water is filtering out the upper pond into the lower one. Probably a lot of these things I could have gotten away with not doing, but I don't really want to get away with anything. I just kind of want to go right down into the detail, otherwise it's not that satisfying to me, which is kind of a bit of a problem, because at some point or another I'm going to start running into limits of props, and even procedural objects I have found out aren't completely unlimited. But in certain areas I'm going to curb my detailing, and places like this, which are real points of interest, I'm going to go all out the way I have done here. Speaking of which, here I'm using these waterfalls as the eponymous cascade of fountains. And I've been very good and tried to conserve the amount of waterfalls that I've used by just lengthening them so that they run the entire course of the cascade, and then completely undoing any conservation that I might have achieved there by adding loads and loads of layers of water surfaces and further waterfalls to add the backsplash at each level of the cascade. So that sort of makes it one step forward and two steps back. Honestly, that's fine by me. When it comes to this game, I'm pretty much results orientated. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll agree that it was worthwhile. What you see me doing here is I'm using these little curved pieces as procedural objects, and I'm using them to denote where the water is actually coming out of the concrete walls, because there's no sort of concrete join lines in those particular retaining walls. Now we're getting to the pool at the bottom of the cascade of fountains, and the water runs off from the upper pond into here, and from here it flows down into a small stream that then leads into the lower pond. So we're nearly done with the cascade of fountains here. Just remains to detail it. Unfortunately, I lost some of the footage of the detailing process, so in a moment you'll see it just kind of ping into its finished state. Once I've added these waterfalls in, you'll see there's suddenly loads of decals around and a statue of Georgy Zhukov, which I actually removed in the end. I didn't feel like it was appropriate to have a statue in that particular spot, so I replaced it with some planters and a couple of sapling trees. But we're moving on now to the surroundings of the cascade of fountains, and it's a plant originally called the Torgmash plant. In the 80s, it was renamed Sistema, and according to the document from Roman, it created all kinds of semi-automatic machines. So we're talking things like ticket machines and machines for counting and sorting coins, of which some orders were placed for such machines from England and Hungary. But from an aesthetic standpoint, it's kind of a mishmash of different buildings that make it up, of quite varying eras. So we've got some very 19th century looking factory buildings there, alongside more mid-20th century buildings as well. And overall, it creates that sort of piecemeal effect. Now here I'm just adding some posters, some propaganda sort of posters on these walls, simply to cover up those doors which lead to nowhere on account of the building being at a higher elevation than the pathway that goes alongside the lower pond. Of course, you don't want it to look as though people can just walk out into thin air. But what I'm going to be doing in a moment is I'm going to be starting to lay down some 19th century looking buildings on the actual street level. So we've kind of moved out of the pond area just a little bit. And this is going to be lining the western half of Kaliningrad Street, which is going to be our limit for where we're building up to for this episode. Here I just wanted to show that those staircases are fully functional thanks to some invisible pathways, although people do still tend to disappear into them just a little bit. And as I'm finishing up the last details of Kaliningrad Street and the Sistema plant, I think that will about do it for this section. So I will see you all a little bit downstream. The rest of the lower pond is one of those areas when, in previous attempts at recreating something like Kaliningrad, it's very tempting to just treat it like any other park and kind of have an assortment of paths that are fairly arbitrary in their direction. And if you're going for the kind of accuracy that I'm sort of trying to achieve in this series, that's not really the best way to approach it. All of these paths converge on each other at specific places for specific reasons, like, for instance, this spot here which I'm creating, which is this sort of cistern that also acts as a kind of a bandstand or a viewing platform for the rest of the pond. So the way I approached it this time was to start with the points of interest and work from there. And there are several different points of interest in the lower pond. There are a couple of those sort of cisterns or bandstand spots, a few different decorative staircases, and as you might have spotted when I was showing footage from the documents that Roman sent me, there is a helicopter park on the western bank of the lower pond, about halfway up towards the upper pond. And that's not even mentioning the buildings that line the pond as well. There's the House of Trade Unions up at the top end, and the House of Pioneers. In this timeline, there's only going to be one of those completed so far. That's going to be the House of Trade Unions, but in this timeline, it's going to be called the House of Culture of Fishermen. And as for the House of Pioneers, that's not going to be finished in this timeline. In real life, it wasn't finished until 1984, so we're 4 years out from that in any case. At this stage, it's going to be in its early stages of construction, with just a sort of brownfield site cleared for it, and a corrugated metal fence surrounding it. And we'll have some of those animated excavators lining that area, just to make it look like something's cooking up there. You'll notice as well, I've really restrained myself on placing down trees and foliage and things like that in this area. It's quite open air, this section of the lower pond, and I think you'll find most well-maintained parks are more like this than sort of thick canopied areas with loads and loads of trees. I think that's a thing that we Cities Skylines players often get a little bit wrong. I know I do anyway. So what I tend to do is, however many trees I've placed down, I then go back and remove 50% of them, and then remove 50% of that, and then you're looking at a more realistic amount of trees. Oh look, some nice little sailboats. I forgot about that. Always good to think about what your citizens might actually enjoy doing in a certain place, just to make it look that little bit more realistic, I guess. But we've moved upstream now to the helicopter park. This was actually demolished in the 1990s, but when it was still standing, it contained a Russian Mi-6 military helicopter. This one's going to contain an Mi-8 helicopter. It was a subsequent version of it, and it's what was available on the workshop, but it does look quite similar. It's missing a key component you might notice, however. And to solve that problem, we're going to bring in another helicopter you might recognize from a certain 90s video game.
Behind D. Colonel, what's a Russian gunship doing here?
I have no idea.
Well, I can tell you it's here just so we can harvest its rotor blades. And unless, of course, you're a proper helicopter geek and you know all the differences between the different rotor blades and all that, I think it looks the part. And this picture leads us quite nicely onto the building that isn't there, the House of Pioneers, which, as I said before, is just going to be a brownfield site at this stage. And to create that effect, I'm just going to use a whole bunch of dirt decals and piles of indeterminate substance that are going to presumably make up some kind of building materials and give a reason for those animated excavators to be there. Can't forget the porta cabins either. And there's going to be a couple more building sites throughout the episode surrounding the ponds, just because I really want to show that this whole area is still sort of under development. It's not quite finished as of yet. Anyway, moving on to putting down some foliage and picking some very young trees for this area, some saplings, just because I want to show that it's quite a new area that's been developed, whereas a bit closer to the water level of the pond, you have some older trees where things haven't changed quite so much so recently. But that takes us up to the House of Trade Unions, or in Konstantinovsk, as it's going to be known, the House of Culture of Fishermen. And this was the first building that Chris Brammer actually made for this series, way back before I had any kind of order for the episodes planned out. So I did think initially that I'd be getting around to the ponds a lot sooner than I actually have done. But there you go, it's still there now. And it's as good as any of the models that Chris has made for this series. Although we will be seeing something pretty special from him a little bit later on in the episode. I've hinted at it already a few times. I think you can probably figure out what it is if you know anything about Kaliningrad at all at this stage. This was one of those buildings that I actually struggled to find any pictures of from the 1980s or 70s. That was until the documents that Roman sent me, and those contained a few really good shots, one in particular from the 1980s, which just perfectly informed me of how that should be decorated with these sort of white stairs at the base, whereas these days it's kind of up on a grassy hill. The stairs are not present anymore as far as I can tell. But that's a testament anyway to how this whole series is a kind of a collective effort at this point, which is pretty appropriate given the subject matter, I guess. Now we're back on Chernyakov Street, which you might remember from the market episode, just to give you some kind of geographical idea of where we are. But I'm just placing down some kiosks and a couple of little concrete blocks, which I'm going to use to put some advertising posters on for those films that I made posters for ages and ages ago now. But that will just about do it for the western part of the lower pond. And we can now go and have a look at what we're going to be dealing with on the southeastern edge of the pond. We're really pushing back towards episode 1 and 2 territory here. So at this end of the pond are this concert hall. Well, it's a former concert hall. Nowadays it's a museum. And this television station, which was actually built at the end of the 80s, early 90s. But in this alternate universe, it's going to be finished already. Now, to create the concert hall / museum, I think in this timeline it's going to be a museum already, I'm using a few instances of Titan's Slovak National Theatre. And then apparently I'm going to promptly move straight on from that because I seem to have lost some footage there. But hey, that's fine, I guess. Who doesn't love housing blocks, am I right? Okay, so we're back on track again. We're back to the television station, which, as I did say, wasn't in real life completed until the early 1990s. But again, I'm going to use that Deus Ex Machina of it's an alternate universe, and we've got a bigger budget, so here it is now. And I'm using that Soviet research center that's been on the workshop since the beginning of time But also, I'm adding an air traffic control tower to the side of it as a procedural object, and just kind of made it a bit taller, just to act as the TV tower, which the real-life building has. So I've kind of made a sort of mock-up of it, in a way. Now, when I filmed this, I know there was a reason I kept pointing up and down that road, but I'm damned if I can remember what it was. In any case, next to the television station, there are these two very large fountains. Now, they are not just there to look pretty. As Roman pointed out to me in his document, those were actually the cooling systems for the television station's very powerful hardware. I mean, at this point, after this episode, I think I could probably write an essay on 100 reasons why fountains are useful. But that probably wouldn't be a very good use of my free time. This is a good use of my free time, and no one can tell me otherwise. Anyway, what am I doing here? I'm using the water surfaces once again to create these odd-looking fountains, from this angle anyway. And then adding in a staircase wall just to bring people down from the level of the television studio to the fountains, where there'll be a little platform for people to sit and splash around in the very delicate cooling system of the television station right next to it. Now, this next little build I have lined up here is one of my own creations rather than something from Kaliningrad. In fact, it's not even inspired by anything from Kaliningrad. Rather, it's inspired by something from northern Sweden, in the town of Kiruna, which I visited and took these photos of. Now, Kiruna is a very heavy industry mining town way up above the Arctic Circle in Sweden, and with this rocket park, it really struck me as kind of feeling a little bit Soviet, given how large the space race and the cosmos looms in the Soviet and present-day Russian culture. And when I found the Soyuz rocket prop on the workshop, I thought this would be a good opportunity to do something a little bit similar to that. So I changed it into a procedural object and squashed it down a little bit, just to change the dimensions a bit and make it quite a bit smaller than the original prop, just to make it clear that this was a replica for a park and not the actual genuine article, the rocket itself. And I thought, just to complete this park, I would put down Chris Brammer's little Leica monument as well, as there's going to be a few little monuments to heroes of the Soviet space race. As you can see, there was Viktor Patsayev, Yuri Romanenko, and Alexei Leonov, three of Kaliningrad's cosmonaut heroes. And I think I can spoil right now, I'm going to do a whole bonus episode on the Soviet space program. But here is where I'm going to blow the halftime whistle. While you've got the video paused, go and check out Z Green Gaming. I'm going to put a link to his channel in the description, and go and watch his new series Agram. He's 2 episodes into it at the moment. So far, it's wonderful stuff. And I'll see you in part 2. In 1970, Kaliningrad embarked upon a construction project that will become known as the Monster, or the Buried Robot. The House of the Soviets would never be completed and will be demolished this year. In another life, in another universe much like our own, it was finished in 1980 in the city of Konstantinovsk, brought to life here by Chris Brammer, who, again, I think has excelled himself. I don't know why. It's probably because I've spent so much time thinking and learning about Kaliningrad over the last few months, but I've become pretty attached to what some people call the ugliest building on Russian soil, and it kind of moves me to know that it's not going to be there for much longer, which is completely illogical, I know, but I am pretty happy to be bringing it to life in digital form for Konstantinovsk. And the building itself was designed by the architect Lev Misoshnikov at the Central Research and Design Institute of Residential and Public Buildings. Now, how many takes do you think it took me to say all that? A big part of creating a fully functioning, fully realized version of the House of the Soviets for Konstantinovsk was getting the surroundings right. And I checked out a few of the original designs for the gardens that surround the House of the Soviets, and they all seem to converge on these two waterfalls, one coming down from the actual building itself, and another one coming down from the parking area to the side of it, as you can see here. And these would have been runoffs from the lower pond, much like the cascade of fountains from the start of this episode. I think this is where the alternate history side of this can be really fun, because if you start out with just one difference from the real world, in this case Prussia being its own Soviet republic rather than a part of Russia, all of the differences start to spiral out from that point, and they reach their logical conclusions in a way that is quite familiar to the real world, and yet different in quite a few exciting ways. But as you can see, that concludes the work on the lower pond. So enjoy the tour, and I'll meet you just up the road. The upper pond's modern history is a very different story to that of the lower pond. This whole area remained natural and wild up until the 2000s, and the foliage was only really broken up by a couple of cafes on the waterside at the northern and southern ends. So we're going to start off with the southern end one. And this was a tricky one, to be honest, because how do you build a cafe on the water without actually bringing up the terrain and ruining the whole waterside effect of it? Well, I just kind of made it out of these walls, these retaining walls, which luckily have pretty much the exact right texture of this particular cafe. And these walls come courtesy of a pack of retaining walls by Epic Lurker on the workshop. So kudos to them. And once I managed to get the right shape for the walls, well, not exactly the right shape, but a version of it, I just put down these cobblestone surfaces to act as the platforms on which people can stand. Now, obviously, people in the game won't be able to stand on surfaces like that, so I ended up adding in invisible pathways that go around the whole circumference of it, and added in these seat side parks. Once again, they can be elevated. They're not terrain conforming like a lot of other like park life props and things like that, and added them to these table and chair props so people will actually go and look like they're having a nice tea by the lake. And you'll see I've added this procedural object building by the roadside there, and that's a beer garden building. I just had to turn it into a procedural object to get rid of the actual beer garden itself from it. But I put it there because that looks quite a lot like a building that does stand in that spot in Kaliningrad. I realise that that's probably a newer building, but I'm going to say this is a leftover from Königsberg era. So now that I've added in all the tables and chairs for people to sit down and have their refreshments, it's time to add all that foliage. Well, at least some of it. And I'm going pretty wild with the weeping silver birches and willows. And remember what I said about removing 50% of all the trees that you put down earlier on? Yeah, forget about it this time. This place needs to be very, very wild. Oh, and you might have noticed parts of this build completed at the end of the last section. That's because this is the build I started with for this whole episode. As you know, I don't do things in order. Everything goes pretty non-linearly in my world. So if things are out of order, that's just the way things are. After completing this little parapet using these embankment arches, it's time to move on to the second cafe on the waterside. This one's at the northern end of the upper pond. And I tried a few different ways of going about this one, but in the end I settled on using a pier as the main base for the structure, and then using these procedural object cubes with wooden textures as the sort of side walls. And then use these glass roof props to create that sort of wave appearance of the roof, this cafe/boathouse. I think it's those glass roofs that I'm searching desperately through the Find It menu for right here. Oh, found them. They're always in the last place you look. Of course, to make this whole cafe seem at least a bit functional, I added in this Raduga cafe building from the workshop, which I've used quite a few different places across the city, but it's one of those structures that you can quite easily get away with repeating. Didn't I say earlier I didn't want to get away with anything? Well, maybe I want to get away with this one thing at least. Here I'm adding those same tables and chairs from the previous cafe, but I have learnt from my mistakes previously, and this time I'm just preparing one with the actual seat site parts away from the actual site they're going to be, and then just copying and pasting them everywhere, rather than just adding in all the props in one go and then trying to squeeze in the little seat site parks in these fiddly little places and not really seeing where they're actually going. So, you know, you live and learn. I always use these invisible parking spaces here for whenever there's meant to be informal parking, if you see what I mean. And it's always good to set them at odd angles to each other if they are especially informal, so that cars don't look too orderly as they're just kind of perched up on a driveway. In any case, I'm round to adding a few planters on the outside of this cafe, and we're getting down to the last details of this section. Just adding in a couple of background buildings, but I don't want to get too bogged down in the details of these, because that is for another episode. And right now, we're moving on to another build, which for some of you is going to seem a tad familiar. This is the Rossgarten Gate and the Don Tower, otherwise known as Kaliningrad Amber Museum. Now, I'm going to dedicate a whole bonus episode at some point to amber in the Kaliningrad region. The buildings themselves are once again part of those 19th century fortifications, the same as the Wrangel Tower, which we built in the last full-length episode. And I essentially copied and pasted the same Vienna Gaslocker building over to this side of the upper pond from the other. But the Rossgarten Gate was a different story, and I had to use a lot of different procedural objects mashed up together to get the right effect for this one. but the base building was part of Malmö Central Station from Sweden. And I just used a lot of the Citadel of Lille city wall packs to kind of cover up the excess of that particular building to create the effect of a 19th century fortification. And as you can see here, this is where the upper pond turns into a moat for the city walls. And once again, I had to use a lot of terraforming networks to get the water to behave itself, which it rarely does in Cities Skylines, but in the end it stopped causing me any bother. Now, this here was a real fun detail I liked adding in, the old sort of drawbridge that led into the city through the Rossgarten gate. And it's nothing too special, it's just an elevated pedestrian road. I think it's actually vanilla as well, but it looked the part, so didn't really feel I needed to edit it too much or add decals or anything like that. And here you can see me struggling with the water as I try to create the outline for the city walls. And I've made a start on it in this episode because it was just nice to have this particular section there in the background for the cinematics at the end, but I will be getting around to the rest of it over the next couple of full-length episodes, so it won't be incomplete for much longer. That being said, I did start doing some of the more pain-in-the-ass infrastructure stuff, like adding in the invisible pathways and the staircases here, just because I like to save future Dan a headache. Unlike the area around the Wrangel Tower, I wanted the grass surrounding the Don Tower to look quite manicured and well looked after, so that's why I'm using these grass slopes that really nicely cover up the patchy bits of grass that occur when you have sort of steep slopes going into water, and I didn't really want to smooth out that slope now that I'd gotten the water to really behave itself well. But for that particular area, that grass slope sort of marks the limit of where things are nicely manicured and looked after. After that point on, everything gets a little bit more wild. And this bridge is the gateway to that wild world, which, as you'll see at the end of this video, is exactly what the citizens of Konstantinovsk seem to want, as this bridge becomes one of the busiest crossing points in the entire city. It's just full of foot traffic, and I'm pretty chuffed with how it turned out in the end. But as we start to tidy things up around the Don Tower, I think this section is pretty much coming to an end. So I'll meet you on the other side of the bridge. Friends, we're on the home stretch, and the home stretch is lined thick with trees. This is, of course, the regular tying up loose ends part of the episode, and the main thing I want to achieve here is getting the upper pond to look really, really wild. But there are a couple of little landmarks that I want to get in at the end here, like this small embankment towards the southern end of the upper pond. This is just over the road from the Wrangel Tower from the market episode. And in Kaliningrad, this little embankment is famous for having these 4 Hermann Thiel sculptures from 1913 of a sea lion, a seal, a sea elephant, and a walrus. But unfortunately, I couldn't find any kind of sculptures that looked remotely like any of those on the workshops, so I'm gonna just say those didn't really make it through the Second World War. Or maybe not that, that's a bit final, isn't it? Let's just say that they're in storage at the museum in the lower pond. Maybe we'll add them in at a later date if we can find something that looks a little bit like those particular sculptures. Regardless, the embankment itself has been restored to its former glory. And now we can get crazy, adding in some dirt paths and nature trails going through the thick woods of the lakeside. While that's going on, I want to talk a little bit about what I've got coming up on this channel, because we're about 3 episodes away from the end of Season 1 of Konstantinovsk, after which I want to take a little bit of a break from it. Not too long, because I'm still really enjoying building in this city, but I do want to start doing a couple of other different things. One of those things is definitely going to be a Workers and Resources Soviet Republic series, which will act as a sister series to Konstantinovsk, in which I'll be taking care of the whole of the Prussian Soviet Socialist Republic, besides the city of Konstantinovsk. And that'll be sort of live play stuff, not the sort of time-lapse footage the way you're seeing it done here. But for Cities Skylines related stuff, there are 2 things that I really want to do, but I'm not sure which one to do first. And I'm going to write them both in the comments below and do a little poll. So I want your input on this. Which should I do first? A Tajikistan series, or one based on the book The City in the City by China Mayville? I'll write more details about this in the comments below. Easier to write it than to say it. That piano means that we're down to our last few minutes here. So it's time to really wrap up these loose ends. I really want to be able to look out across the lake from one end or the other and not see too much unfinished. So that's why I'm adding in these residential towers in the slight distance from the lake itself, just to have that sort of viewpoint, but without doing too much in the way of detail. We'll come back around to them some other day. But I did say I'd be adding in a couple more building sites to the pond areas, and this is one of those. Well, this whole block is going to be these sort of half-constructed or half-demolished buildings. I'm not really decided on what sort of condition they're meant to be in yet. There's definitely a couple of buildings that are scheduled for full demolition, as you can see there. They're kind of these dilapidated old farmhouses, but most of the blocks around the upper end of the pond are going to be these incomplete sections of either demolition or construction. Now, this footbridge, however, is definitely under construction. It's in its early stages of development, and it is based on a newish bridge that goes across the upper pond. I wanted to show it here in its early stages, so I popped that crane overlooking it, and then realized, how's it going to get up to that block there? So put down these concrete slabs and slanted them so that it looked like up ramps. And then I remembered that I had these worker markers that I downloaded from the workshop. Basically, you just plop these markers down and it will spawn workers that will walk around, and it'll make the construction site look really alive. Might even go back and do that on a couple of other construction sites. Not sure yet, but either way, I'm pretty chuffed with how this one turned out. But my favorite detail of all in this whole area is coming up here. Now, I started placing down these little crowd generators all around the place just to get people walking down these sort of like dirt paths. But then this one spot here in particular, I placed loads down, and I thought I would make a proper thing of it. So I put down some beach towels and a hamper, and then started going crazy with these little props of market breads and cheeses and stuff like that. And I thought I'd make a nice little picnic scene. And in the end, I decided to get rid of that outdoor gazebo thing. It just didn't look right. So instead, I put down a couple of deck chairs and used those seat side props so people would actually sit down on them. And then I thought, what's missing from this scene? And then I remembered I didn't just have worker markers, I have quite a few animal markers as well. Also, that little animated table tennis scene, that's amazing, another one from Sven Berlin there. I then noticed I had these swan markers, so I just went to town with that and made it come truly alive. It really reminds me of those sort of spots in cities where you can go wild swimming, like the lake in Treptower Park in Berlin. And looking at this was, I think, the first time I really thought to myself, yeah, I think I wouldn't mind living in Konstantinovsk. Well, I really enjoyed that one. This one was so much fun to make, and to get to do the House of the Soviets and to really understand how the ponds of Kaliningrad work and to build them properly was such a thrill for me. And I enjoy all of these episodes, but this one was pretty special to me. So a huge thank you to Chris Brammer and to Roman especially, because without your help, this one would not have been possible. And I love that this has been a collective effort, which is why I'm really looking forward to hearing your input on what I should do for my next Cities Skylines series while Konstantinovsk is on a break. The next episode is going to be in June, so until then, take good care of each other, and I'll see you in the next one.